All right, hello everybody, I'm Richard, and today I'm going to be talking about an acanthodian endoskeleton in this fish, Diplacanthus, which is this middle Devonian acanthodian from Scotland. So firstly, thanks to these people, thanks also to my supervisor Martin, who's on the talk, so I didn't give him an acknowledgement, but because he's an author. So this talk is again about early vertebrates, and a bit I'm particularly interested in is a bit that I couldn't have had a better introduction to than Mike's talk yesterday, which is this very early part of the chondrichthyan stem group. And in recent years, this problematic group called acanthodians, which are notorious for being horrible splats and this vague shape of fishes with very few characters, have kind of all been moved on pretty confidently onto this chondrichthyan stem. So this gives us all of these lovely taxa on this stem, but we have almost no comparable characters for any of them with which to compare to other kind of groups. And so one of our problems is to try and find these characters. So as Mike summarised, down is forward. So as Mike summarised yesterday, the current state of our understanding about this is that in recent phylogenetic analyses, we seem to get this kind of a rump at the bottom of the chondrichthyan stem, which is the sister group to all other chondrichthyans. And this seems to include these, loosely, these acanthodians called Diplacanthids, Ischnocanthids, and acanthodids. And they don't necessarily form a clade like I've done here. Sometimes one of them is the sister group to all the others. And more relatively cranwards on the chondrichthyan stem group, we find this other kind of polytomy of things, which includes these climatiid acanthodians, which are these heavily armoured guys, and lots of things that you'd call a chondrichthyan, like Gladbachus, or Doliodus, or Pucapampella. And for the vast majority of these animals, we have no internal information. What we do have is two acanthodian kind of well-understood endoskeletons, one of which is Acanthodes. This is a Permian acanthodian, so quite late in the acanthodians kind of history. And it's understood as quite a lot of natural moulds, but these are quite confusing and have led to lots of different interpretations of its gill skeleton and its brain. And also far more recently is Tomacanthus, which is one of these kind of climatiid acanthodians, which probably comes out somewhere in this group, or not group, this kind of area, it's grade. And this is known from this kind of slightly grotty basocranium, which seems to show some characters. And also, I found some gills within this slab, which I talked about before at different conferences. So we've got these two things where we have the gills and the brain case to at least some extent. But we've got more of these kind of things that you call conventional chondrichthyans. Pucapampella is one that's known from a brain case. Doliodus is another, which is known from a brain case and now kind of the whole body. And Gladbachus is the other one, which Mike talked about a lot yesterday. So this is kind of where we stand. These are the endoskeletons we have. And so the animal I'm talking about today is Diplacanthus, as I mentioned. These are some slightly perturbed-looking Diplacanthuses about to be devoured by a Cocosteus in the excellent National Museum of Scotland Devonian fish exhibition. And like most acanthodians, Diplacanthus is almost entirely known from these kind of vaguely fish-shaped things. We know a bit about its shoulder girdle, which you can see here. We know about its scales and its spines quite well, but we know almost nothing about its internal skeleton, except for one specimen. And that's the specimen I'm talking about today, which is from Tynet Burn in northern Scotland. And this specimen, if you look at the head, it's got what looks suspiciously like a load of branchial arches, and you've got a mandible there, and possibly even some bits up here. This specimen has been known about for a long time. D.M.S. Watson talked about it a bit in his 1930s big monograph on the acanthodians. But no one's ever really been able to make anything of it because it's this horrible squashed mess. So we decided to synchrotron scan it to see what lay inside. And we found that it has this neurocranial and gill arch material inside, which we can use to try and compare outside these kind of acanthodians to other things. But before you get carried away imagining gorgeous gill arches and beautiful brain cases, this is not that. It's a horrible squash thing. So this talk is really about trying to mine what characters we can out of this squashed monstrosity to compare to other things. So this is the results of the synchrotron scan overall. This is as if you're looking at it from the inside of the specimen, and as it's so flattened, I put the mould behind it, so this is the mould of the surface in grey. And you can see we've got, this is probably the orbit here. We've got a mandibular arch, this is the palatal quadrate. We've got two Meckel's cartilages, so the lower jaw's down here. This weird dermal plate in the jaw, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then the brain case is preserved as there's possibly a little bit of it up here, and then behind the orbit, the kind of this edge of the otic region, the rest is presumably lost to the counterpart. The counterpart, by the way, has never been mentioned, so it's either at the bottom of the Moray Firth for the last 200 years since it was collected, or it's in a museum collection somewhere. So if you ever spot a Diplacanthus brain case, let me know. Probably the other half of this. And then we've got all the branchial arches down here, kind of squashed between the shoulder girdle, which is slightly off here, covered by this dermal plate. And we've got some vertebrae behind, which I won't really talk about, but if you're keen, you can ask me. So there we go, mandibular arch, branchial arches, brain case, and vertebrae. So first off, what have we got in the mandibular arch? So the mandibular arch firstly comprises this big palatal quadrate. This seems quite similar to what we see in acanthodes. It's got this tall otic process, and it seems to have ossified in these sort of three parts. So this ortopalatine with a basal process down there. We've got a metapterygoid up here. It looks like it's articulated with the quadrate here, but I don't think it actually is. If you look at it from the front, it's kind of a separate, on this kind of separate part of the mould. And this metapterygoid seems to have this foramen, which we see in acanthodes and some things that look a bit like acanthodes, but not very much else. So that's a possible character. We've got the Meckel's cartilage. So the Meckel's cartilage has a preglenoid process, so its articulation looks like other chondrichthyans, where it has this kind of process in front of the glenoid. And this glenoid process looks a lot like the one in acanthodes. So in most chondrichthyans, it's often called a mandibular knob because it's sort of circular, well not circular, kind of like knob-shaped. But in Diplacanthus, it's kind of this oblique flange that sweeps across the Meckel's cartilage, which looks a lot like acanthodes. So we've got that. And then thirdly, we've got this dermal plate in the mouth, which I talked about. This is a different Diplacanthid called Uraniacanthus. This is from the Man on the Hill locality in Canada. And this also has this plate. It's been misidentified as Meckel's cartilages in some things, but recently Newman et al. Have kind of decided that it's probably this dermal plate that sits in the gape. And this seems to confirm it. It's lying just on top of Meckel's cartilage. Still not entirely sure exactly what it was doing. Suggestions are welcome. It doesn't have any kind of, it's not got any sort of ornament on it. It's just essentially a featureless concave spade. So that's another thing, and that seems to just be in these Diplacanthids, so that's a possible character. So just to reiterate, we've got this foramen, which is in acanthodiforms and Diplacanthiforms. We've got this preglenoid fossa, which is a well-established chondrichthyan character, but is also now in Diplacanthus. And we've got this occlusal plate, which again is a well-established Diplacanthiform thing. So next up, the branchial arches. So the branchial arches are so we just had a lot of branchial arches in the previous talk. This is kind of the ones with Diplacanthus kind of flattened out. So the yellow things are the upper half that went over the top of the pharynx, and the purple things and the blue things are the bottom half that went over the bottom. And most of what we have in Diplacanthus is these keratobranchials, these bottom things. So the right-hand ones are in purple, and the blue ones are the left-hand side. Overall, the branchial arches, there's a few upper bits kind of scattered amongst them. And so it looks kind of like acanthodes. So these epibranchials, which are these top bits, and the fringibranchials, which are the small top bits, kind of look like they've been reconstructed in acanthodes. It kind of plugs into this big debate about whether acanthodes' fringibranchials point forwards or backwards, so forwards like in osteichthyans or backwards like in chondrichthyans, which I won't say anything about. But Diplacanthus seems to be similar to acanthodes in morphology, although nothing's really articulated. And then also an interesting thing about these keratobranchials is they have this weird morphology. They have this kind of medial spoon that sort of sits just underneath the articulation with the epibranchial. And this I've not really seen in anything before. And they've also got this tube that goes up the back, which carried the vascularization. You also see this in Cathamacanthus, which is this chondrichthyan from moth again. So maybe that's an early chondrichthyan thing. And then finally, we get these little intermediate elements. So these have been described in various early chondrichthyans and osteichthyans. They're probably a gnathostome, sort of crown gnathostome plesiomorphy. But note we have those. So the only good character we've really got from that is these intermediate elements. And I say it's a good character, it's not really useful because it's probably this gnathostome plesiomorphy. But now they're in Diplacanthus. And finally, the brain case. So the brain case consists of these parts which we talked about. First, the basio-occipital, which is this bit that sits at the bottom of the back. And this is very narrow, like in acanthodes, and in osteichthyans, and unlike all those chondrichthyans, which come up higher up on the chondrichthyan stem group. So it's this narrowly restricted one. So that's a character. Interestingly also, it appears that it has this tube in for the median dorsal aorta, which you usually just get in actodops, in some weird holocephaly things. But yeah, so I don't really know what to make of that. Secondly, you have this otic region preserved. So only the very edge of it's preserved and lots of it's squashed, but I think it looks like acanthodes. It's got this kind of dorsolateral ridge. This is acanthodes on the right, and you can kind of see this ridge coming round. The bit where I think it is here on this reconstruction of acanthodes. And you also kind of see this in Puca pampella, and I think maybe also in Doliodus, but Doliodus is really squashed. And you don't see it in some other sharks. So that's another possible thing. That might be an early chondrichthyan character we've got going on. Finally, from what we've got, we seem to have the same elements as acanthodies, which implies that we have an otico, occipital, and ventral otic fissure, which I've kind of marked there. And finally, we've got this kind of mystery bit at the front, which I'm not really going to talk about because I can't really work out what it is, but I think it's either the anterior part of the orbit, which would make sense, or this kind of flattened subnasal plate like you see in Doliodus, but suggestions are welcome. So that's more or less everything. So this thin, constricted basioccipital is something that you don't get in all these chondrichthyans. This is possibly quite a good character separating out these acanthodiform things from the other guys. This lateral lateral otic ridge is like is possibly an early chondrichthyany thing. And yeah, so those are the characters we've got. I've kind of mapped them all onto here, so this is just really reiterating what I've said. And so what does this look like in a phylogeny? So I've been working on a data set of acanthodians and various stem-chondrichthyany things, which is mainly based off characters from Mike Coates' recent stuff and also kind of Sam Giles's big nathostome matrix. And it seems to also recover this group. This is sort of, it came out, if people have ever seen acanthodian phylogenies before, they're usually big rakes, and this is suspiciously well resolved, so I'm a bit worried. But it does seem to recover this, this kind of acanthodiae, rump clade of acanthodians that Coates et al. Proposed, which includes the Diplacanthiforms, the Ischnocanthiforms, and acanthodiforms, and some of these weird acanthodians that sort of look like they're a combination of these guys and these guys. And then, notably, it also pushes Gladbachus up out of the sort of acanthodian region onto the top. Well, not the top, but like amongst things like that look more like conventional chondrichthyans. So I think that's about everything. If anyone has any questions.